What you're about to watch is a supercut of a series that I wrote and produced back in 2014 that looked at the history of more than 24 classic video game magazines. It mostly focuses on the lesser-known publications like Incite Video Gaming, Super Gaming, Foul, Raze and Turbo Play. However, it also dives into the backstory of magazines that you've probably heard of, including Die Hard Game Fan, The Adventures of GamePro, and maybe even S.W.A.T.Pro. Look, as far as I'm concerned, these are some of the best videos that I've ever written, and I feel like a lot of the humor still holds up. Let me tell you, I just binge-watched this thing for the first time in years, and I had a giant smile on my face the whole way through. And I'm not gonna lie, I especially love all the shit that I flung at the movie Interstellar. Of all the shows that I've worked on, this is one of my favorites, and it's one that I've been the most excited about bringing back. You see, I've been trying to find a way to revive these retrospectives and continue to introduce the world to weird old magazines. That's why I'm excited to announce that for the first time since 2014, we're going to be posting regular video game magazine retrospectives that tell the strange and troubled histories to a wide assortment of classic video game publications. We're going to be flipping through the pages of a lot of old school magazines that you've probably never heard of, as well as a few that we're going to be tackling in this supercut. There are just so many stories to tell, and I can't wait to introduce you to some of the games journalists that helped to pave the road to where we are today. But before we get into the new stuff, I think it's important for you to watch these old episodes. These 29 episodes give you a sense of what we're going to be doing this year, and maybe even teach you a thing or two about the history of game magazines. And look, even if you don't learn anything, I guarantee that you're going to laugh. These are just a whole lot of fun. So enough with me setting things up and teasing. Let's watch some silly videos about groundbreaking magazines. Here we go.
Do you see these guys? They're sitting around the table talking about their favorite Nintendo Power memories. Charlie likes the funny Howard and Nestor comics, while Sarah is more of a counselor's corner kind of girl. But poor Sam feels completely left out of the conversation. You see, instead of following the exploits of Nintendo, Sam subscribed to Sega Visions, Sega of America's bi-monthly Nintendo Power ripoff. First released in June of 1990, Sega Visions promised a new generation of magazine for anybody interested in the same kind of content found in pretty much every other magazine on the newsstand. Published 6 times a year, each issue ran between 60 to 150 pages, and featured the usual news, reviews, previews, and hint format found in magazines of the time. While not original, this was one of the few places fans of the Genesis, Master System, and Game Gear could go without being reminded that everybody else loves Nintendo. Although clearly tied to a major hardware company, Sega Visions attempted to appear objective. When they finally started publishing reviews in 1992, the magazine chose to only review third-party titles. Nintendo Power, on the other hand, had no problem giving their own game-size scores. But before you give Sega too much credit, they added this disclaimer suggesting they weren't going to be too critical of the third-party titles. Quote, "Unlike the ratings published in other magazines, you won't find any embarrassingly low ratings here. By the time the game has obtained Sega's seal of quality, it has already exceeded certain minimum standards." End quote. Oddly enough, Sega didn't exactly stick to this mantra. Between 1992 and 1994, Sega Visions gave very few games a score higher than 90%. Madden 93, Where in Time is Carmen Sandiego, Lemmings, Lakers vs. Bulls, Desert Strike, and Atomic Runner were among the magazine's highest-rated games, with many of those receiving just 85%. On the other hand, Double Dragon is Sega Vision's lowest-scoring game, receiving a terrible 40%. This was followed by Chester Cheetah with a 48%, and Andre Agassi's Tennis, Barcelona 92, Crash Test Dummies, Ernest Evans, and Sid of Valis all at 50%. The magazine's review average was just 68%, which certainly doesn't say anything good about Sega's seal of quality. In 1994, Sega decided to switch to a brand new rating system, which substituted Sonic the Hedgehog's head for the traditional star rating. Although a welcome change, it ultimately led to a confusing article that explained the new rating system by reviewing members of the Beatles, types of sandwiches, late-night talk show hosts, Rocky movies, and even dinosaurs. Beyond reviewing games, Sega Visions also looked at Sega's many innovations. They devoted a lot of pages to the Activator, VR helmet, Sega CD, and even the 32X. They were hopelessly optimistic about everything Sega did, even when it involved selling kids on horrible Sonic the Hedgehog costumes. And when they told me that most Sega Visions readers either own a Sega CD or are about to get one, I'm not sure if they actually believed it, or if they were just putting on a brave face. Speaking of brave faces, Sam can finally get in on the conversation now that his friends have stopped talking about Nintendo Power and moved on to discussing how disappointing Interstellar was. Okay, so you're about to die. Look, I'm sorry. I really can't do anything about that, and I would appreciate it if you stopped hounding me about calling 911. I mean, I get it. Life-saving help is kind of a big deal to you. But I need to tell somebody about Incite Video Gaming, the short-lived concept that attempted to merge the worst of Electronic Gaming Monthly and Maxim magazine. The result is about as ugly as that bloody wound you've got there. Launched in December of 1999, Incite was for teenage boys who were both curious about the next Bond game and in serious need of Denise Richards pictures to masturbate to. Forget talking about the most important video game developers at the time. This was a magazine interested in interviewing the chick from VIP that wasn't Pamela Anderson. Are you curious to know more about Dead or Alive 2? Then don't bother reading this pictorial spread between the busty babes of Son of the Beach. Month after month, Incite would ask stupid questions to models, wrestlers, and comedians with only a passing interest in video games. Skipping the usual reviews and previews, Incite had a monthly feature that had musicians, athletes, and TV hosts squaring off against each other in various video games. While I'm sure watching members of Blink-182, Bush, 311, and Filter play Test Drive 6 was a blast in person, it doesn't translate well to paper. There's a reason no other magazine was publishing this type of article, and it was because of stupid comments like, "I'm driving like a drunk driver," and "It's another instance of a man trying to keep me down." Ugh. Much like you, Incite didn't stick around for very long. While mixing boobs and video games seems like an obvious choice, the truth is that teenage boys had plenty of better options for both video game magazines and spank material. Hey, have you even been listening to me? Christ, you're already dead. I need to say this whole thing again to somebody else. Hey kid, you want to be cool? You want to get all the girls and drive around the neighborhood like in little hip-hop videos? Then you should start a zine. That's right, a zine. It's a magazine you put together in your spare time, you photocopy it at the local library, and then you trick people into buying it for like a couple of bucks. You won't earn much, but it will give you enough money to buy drugs and convince everybody else that you're the coolest kid in school. Once you've done that, you can shut down that zine and roll around with the sweet honeys you're sure to attract. Back in 1993, Brian M. Dadu had a dream to create the ultimate video game magazine. It would be the ultimate magazine for the competitive game player and feature full-color pictures of all the hottest games. It would be rad! Unfortunately, Brian didn't have a whole lot of money to throw at this project and came up with a short-lived curiosity, NewType Gaming. Things started rocky with Brian's masterpiece filling up a mere 18 unmarked pages. The magazine was filled with black and white images, reviews of outdated games, and a layout that looks like it was assembled on a Canon word processor from 1988. Much like Playboy magazine, NewType Gaming saved up all of their color for a centerfold spread. These two pages are the best the magazine has ever looked, and it shows Brian's potential. Unfortunately, the rest of the magazine looks like this. Hey, did you know that former GameSpot editor-in-chief Greg Kasavin got his start at NewType Gaming? Oh, I see. You've already had the drugs and now you're stoned. Yeah, great. Just ignore me. Just ignore what I'm saying. I'm sure the history of NewType Gaming isn't that interesting anyways. This man was just fired from his job. Did he sleep with the boss's wife or start up an office fight club? No, he stole. That's right, this man is a thief. He's a plagiarist. The worst kind of criminal. Well, maybe not the worst, but definitely worse than the people who talk on the phone in the movie theater. Anyway, the point is, he was fired for passing somebody else's work off as his own. And now he'll go home and he'll drink his troubles away on cheap American beer. Speaking of plagiarists, let me introduce you to S.W.A.T.Pro. This was a short-lived bi-monthly magazine that combined content originally found in GamePro with, well, more content originally found in GamePro. All the tips, tricks, tactics, strategies, reviews, and even advertisements seem to come straight out of GamePro. Just about the only thing not copied and pasted is this editorial, and even that may have been lifted from somewhere else. I don't know. For those bad at paying attention, S.W.A.T.Pro only came out 6 times a year and offered a fraction of the content found in GamePro. It stubbornly refused to include new content or give gamers even one solid reason to spend the money, not to mention that it was the exact same price as the much larger GamePro, which published all these reviews and tricks months earlier. The only tips, tactics, and strategies I see employed here are those used to sucker people into buying S.W.A.T.Pro. It is worth mentioning that the magazine originally started as a small supplement attached to certain issues of GamePro. These were inoffensive pullouts that published additional cheat codes, something gamers couldn't get enough of in the early 1990s. Eventually, the supplement became its own standalone magazine, using nothing but recycled content. And just like Saved by the Bell the college years, it didn't take long for people to realize that this is nothing more than a cash grab. As for this guy, he's about to scour the internet and plagiarize somebody else's resume. I'm not going to lie, I sometimes get bored reviewing video games. That's why I've moved on to critiquing lonely losers on dating sites. Like, take this guy for example. He's definitely rocking the mullet look, and that mustache really goes with his belt. Oh, and here's another handsome devil. His body position definitely suggests he's too cool for this dating site. Love the sweater. What's Richard Marx doing here? Dude, you had me at hello. Apparently, I'm not the only critic who sometimes gets bored reviewing video games, because it didn't take long for Electronic Gaming Monthly to create an annual buyer's guide that allowed them to staple scores to other things, including your favorite retro game systems. Initially started as a regular issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Video Game Buyer's Guide was officially spun off into its own magazine in 1991. Released between October and November, this holiday issue recapped the year's reviews, recycled a few previews, and archived all of the older scores. Did you know that Sushi X gave the Sega Genesis a 9 out of 10 in 1991? He called it the leader of the pack and noted that the Super NES can't compare. Yet. He gave Nintendo System a 7, fearing that unless programmers of the 16-bit giant can solve the horrible problems of slowdown and flickering, the system will die early. Yeah, a real psychic, this one. On top of pissing off fanboys with their system reviews, the Video Game Buyer's Guide also gave out awards. The first thing they would do is name a game of the year, which included Sonic the Hedgehog, Street Fighter II, Samurai Showdown, Twisted Metal, and Donkey Kong Country. They would also hand out secondary prizes, such as the most innovative new game, hottest character in a game, most lawsuits, and best game system that's a year late. I have some bad news for you, EGM. That Super NES CD is going to be more than a year late. While the yearly awards continued well into the 21st century, Electronic Gaming Monthly stopped reviewing consoles after only a few issues. It's a shame we'll never know what EGM would have given the Xbox, or GameCube, or PlayStation 2. As for this guy, I say buck up. I know you're lonely now, but hey, tomorrow's a new day, and your luck could change at any time. And if not, who cares? They've made incredible advances in fleshlight technology. There's a killer on the loose, and you, a dopey but good-natured police officer, there's no time for indecision. Lives are on the line, and it's up to you, Officer Random Guy, to stop the madman and keep the street safe. But before you decide to use the standard show of force, might I recommend something a bit, unorthodox. Ditch the standard gun and throw out the rulebook entirely, because what you need to do is go turbo force. No. I'm definitely thinking of something else. Turbo Force was a short-lived magazine that looked at all of the biggest and best games of the TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo Duo. It lasted 4 issues. Yeah. Although published by the same people that worked on Electronic Gaming Monthly, Mega Play, and Super NES Buyer's Guide, Turbo Force had a decidedly different look and tone. There were no reviews, and the magazine didn't seem especially interested in the usual cheat codes and half-assed rumors. Instead, it focused on page after page of boring vanilla previews of games you probably won't find at the local Toys R Us. Curiously, Turbo Force did have a section for fanzines. Each of the 4 issues helped promote up-and-coming game journalists from around the country, listing prices and what was presumably the home address of each editor. When the magazine wasn't doxing their readers, they interviewed some of the zine's creators. This 1993 interview was with the creator of Next Generation magazine. No, not that Next Generation magazine. I'm talking about this one by Casey Lowe. One of the contributing editors of Turbo Force was Johnny Turbo, a fictional character who bore a striking resemblance to Kevin Smith. This prompted a curious letter from a reader complaining about the advertisement he saw in another magazine. Brian, an outraged EGM reader, Pacuna, wrote, "I would tend to expect some kind of rivalry between major game companies, but the Turbo Technologies ad in the January 1993 issue of EGM was more mean-spirited propaganda than I can take quietly." 1 month later, Turbo Force shut down production. Despite several valiant attempts, the TurboGrafx never caught on in the United States, and there just wasn't enough need for this type of magazine going into 1994. So on second thought, maybe you should use the standard Show Force and, not the Turbo Force that I recommended earlier. This is Kim. What you may not know about this spunky brunette is that she recently had a child and is a little unsure about who the father is. At first she thought it was Paul, but later she realized the DNA results didn't quite match up. So then she moved on to Carlos, Jimmy, Bert, and Fernando, but none of those came back positive. So after a dozen tries, she's returned to Maury's long-running show to get to the bottom of this mystery. But before Mr. Connie Chung reads the results, let me first tell you a mystery about as baffling as Kim's pregnancy. Like most of the people who own a mailbox, mine is often overflowing with bills I never intend on paying and advertisements I can't be bothered to look at. But every so often the mailbox surprises me. Instead of the usual collection notices and angry letters, I'll find an issue of Casual Connect. Created by the Casual Games Association, this colorful publication features a strong collection of essays, articles, and interviews about the casual game scene. This is a space that has exploded thanks to the invent of smartphones and personal tablets, and Casual Connect has managed to capitalize on the trend with some of the best and most thought-provoking pieces I've read in recent years. Casual Connect is the type of magazine where you can watch art come to life on one page, and then flip to a detailed analysis of the kind of people that are playing Facebook games. And as somebody who rarely talks about mobile games, many of the pieces are real eye-openers. Casual Connect is the last physical magazine I still read. But as good as it is, you won't find Casual Connect next to Cosmo or Teen Beat on the magazine rack. According to the fine print, this magazine is sent out to 17,000 game industry professionals and members of the press. So that explains the mystery, I guess. It's because I'm a member of the press. I just did a full advertisement for them without even realizing it. Oh, crap. I think I'm part of the problem. Anyway, maybe Maury can bring Kim some good news and we can get out of this episode with a happy ending. Oh no, that's horrible. Oh, awful. Look, I know how you feel, Kim. I know how you feel. Meet Jake. This good-looking fella is getting ready for a hot date. Jake is feeling really confident right now, and there's a reason for that. He has the restaurant picked out, the perfect bouquet of flowers, and a plan to lie his ass off. But don't worry, it's not what you think. You see, instead of bragging about how good he is at everything, he's going to spend the entire time lowering expectations. That way, when she finally realizes that he's maybe 30% better than he let on, she'll actually be impressed with his averageness. It's a shame Super Gaming didn't take this advice. Launched in 1991 by the same publisher as Electronic Gaming Monthly, this magazine decided to overpromise and underdeliver. With a name like Super Gaming, you might expect this to be the size of a phone book. But alas, the editors were only able to fill up 32 pages. And it wasn't super because it lasted a long time either. Super Gaming only made it 4 issues, with a total of just 128 pages. To set itself apart, Super Gaming was positioned as a magazine dedicated solely to international games and systems. This gave the editors of Electronic Gaming Monthly a chance to talk about the types of games that you only find in the import shops. Initially, the magazine was designed to simply preview games, but in the second issue they decided to also review these titles. The reviews were handled by Mike Vallis, Ken Williams, and somebody who went by the name of Samurai. Ugh. Despite noble ambitions, Super Gaming quickly realized there wasn't a market big enough to support a whole magazine about international games. Either that or consumers rebelled against a $3 magazine with only 32 pages. Maybe if it had lowered expectations, people would have bought more than 4 issues. Just ask Jake. Women can't resist a man who sounds a lot worse than he actually is. I'm pretty sure that's how Lyle Lovett won over Julia Roberts and Billy Bob Thornton snagged Angelina Jolie. But you don't remember they were even a couple? Those aren't current enough references? God, you people are never happy. Meet Carrie. She's about to lose her job at the local video store. Just like the milkmen, lamplighters, telegraph operators, and typesetters that came before her, Carrie's job has been outmoded, and all those years of hard work are about to vanish in an instant. But don't worry, Carrie doesn't blame the customers or even her boss. In fact, she blames you. She blames everybody on the internet who ruined her livelihood. You know who else is a little bitter at the internet? Tips and Tricks magazine. Here's a magazine that had a good thing going for more than 150 issues, and then suddenly the internet comes around and nobody wants a magazine with cheat codes because Google exists. Gone are the good old days when finding a particular code in Metal Gear Solid meant thumbing through dozens of magazines trying to find the right page. Tips and Tricks ran between 1993 and 2007, and many issues boasted that their pages held thousands of codes. While Electronic Gaming Monthly and GamePro were forced to talk exclusively about the newest games, Tips and Tricks could devote months, even years, to the same game. As long as a game like Mortal Kombat was popular, a magazine like this could continue to run codes and strategies month after month after month. Oddly enough, Tips and Tricks started its life as a spin-off to Video Game Magazine, which in turn was a spin-off to Video Games and Computer Entertainment. When Dom Narut pitched the idea of a magazine filled with nothing but tips, tricks, cheats, and strategies, his bosses weren't impressed and didn't think there was a market. Years later, this idea was resurrected and Tips and Tricks was born. As it turns out, this gimmicky idea lasted longer than both Video Games and Computer Entertainment and Video Games Magazine combined. But as great of an idea as it would eventually meet its toughest competition, the internet. As soon as gamers had the internet on their computers, laptops, phones, and even handheld game systems, it became obvious that there wasn't a need for this type of print magazine. Before calling it quits, Tips and Tricks magazine managed to publish more than 600,000 cheats across 14 years. It's among the longest-running video game magazines of all time. But despite being so prolific, few gamers will ever go back and read past issues of Tips and Tricks. The layout is too chaotic, and it's much easier to find codes online. And just like Carrie, this magazine is a relic of its time. Daphne is the only person in her small town that knows anything about stunt kites. While her friends were off chasing boys and getting into trouble, Daphne spent nights by the ocean perfecting her tricks and getting pulled down the beach. While this certainly helped her stay in shape and relieve stress, Daphne noticed that it didn't exactly make her popular. That is until Dustin Sams, the world's most popular kite flyer, came to town. Suddenly everybody wanted to know about kites. Finally, Daphne was popular, and then Dustin left town and everybody stopped caring. They went back to listening to awful music and getting pregnant at 16. Except for the underage sex and stunt kite competition, this story mirrors that of 3, the magazine for 3DO enthusiasts. The good news is that this was the single most popular 3DO magazine of all time. It's like Rolling Stone for people who like Trip Hawkins. Of course, the reality is that 3 is the only magazine specifically dedicated to the 3DO. And for that brief year, this magazine had the market completely cornered. Launched in the summer of 1994, 3, for 3DO enthusiasts, was a bi-monthly look at everything 3DO. The publication largely focused on previews as well as interviews and news pieces that were always flattering to the company still making games for the 3DO. The few reviews that did make it to print were rarely critical and didn't come with a number score. Because the 3DO software was so mixed, the magazine tried to be a little of everything for everybody. The result was a magazine where Sesame Street numbers and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo were given the same amount of coverage. It's as if 3 never understood who their target audience was, so they decided to hype everything and just cover all their bases. The result was a cheery, always optimistic magazine that quickly disappeared the moment it was clear Sega and Sony were about to dominate the 32-bit market. But for one glorious year, 3 was the only magazine designed specifically for 3DO fans. And just like Daphne, this short-lived publication learned the hard way that fame can be fleeting. Let me introduce you to Cyril Lachelle. That's right, today we're going to be talking about me. Up until last year, Cyril hadn't watched more than 2 or maybe 3 football games total. He had somehow gone his entire life being apathetic to the sport. And then, when his local team ended up going all the way and winning the Super Bowl in dramatic fashion, he started talking like he was a football expert. But here's the thing, he wasn't a football expert. He was just an awful, terrible person who watched a couple dozen games and suddenly thought he had something to say. He should have stuck to talking about video games. Blender magazine is a lot like me. Started in 2004 by Dennis Publishing, Blender covered music like Luke Russert covers the news. Poorly. With a penchant for filling their pages with scantily clad models and musicians. Blender was geared towards young men who didn't mind if every other page was filled with pull-out, scratch, and sniff body spray advertisements. The truth is, I don't know if Blender was good at writing music reviews. I certainly disagreed with some of their takes, but nothing they wrote specifically stood out. So for this video, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they have the chops to review a wide range of musical styles. But like Cyril, Blender couldn't leave it at just doing a bang-up job reviewing the newest albums from Coldplay, Bjork, 311, and that one band that kind of sort of sounds like Alice in Chains. Blender had to go one step further and become the single worst game critic of all time. Not only were their reviews short, but they sounded like they hadn't played the completed game. Blender would routinely review games months ahead of even the dedicated video game magazines, suggesting that what was being reviewed was little more than a preview build. They would offer little insight on the game, instead focusing on broad details that require no actual time with the controller in hand. Need proof? In the July 2005 issue, Blender reviewed SOCOM 3 US Navy SEALs, an online-focused PlayStation 2 game that didn't come out until, and I'm not making this up, October. Given the magazine's lead time, this review was likely written for maybe 5 months before the actual release, which kind of explains why the review sounded like this. Everyone loves a good terrorist hunt. Good thing, too, since the third iteration of Sony's SEALs games takes the heavily armored soldiers through Poland, Morocco, and Bangladesh, searching for tangos under every rock. 20 vehicles have been added to the mix, Humvees, SOC assault boats, T-72 tanks, and more, all decked out with heavy artillery, turning this battle into a cross-country tour de morte. Honestly, it sounds like somebody reviewed a press release. If Cyril was smart, he would heed this warning and stick to topics he knows something about. But if I know anything about Cyril, he's not very smart. Electronic Gaming Monthly is the Street Fighter II of video game magazines. No, I'm not saying that because this periodical ran Capcom fighting games on literally dozens of covers, though that also was a troubling trend now that you mention it. But anyway, much like Ryu, Ken, and the rest of the World Warriors, EGM had a hard time counting. Instead of moving on to the next number, they both decided to focus on spin-offs. It ended up taking Capcom 6 long years to count to the next number. On the other hand, Electronic Gaming Monthly only took 5. But wait a second, why does a video game magazine need a sequel? Launched in 1994, EGM2 was designed to house the overflow that didn't quite make it into Electronic Gaming Monthly proper. The result was a magazine that looked almost exactly the same. Every element was eerily familiar, from the editorials to the pages of news, to the rumors section, to the cheat codes. Hell, even the ads were the same. But there was one big difference. While Electronic Gaming Monthly was known for its four-person reviews, EGM2 opted against any critical pieces. Their pages were largely filled with expanded previews and helpful guides. To their credit, the second magazine focused on a lot of smaller titles for handhelds and often ignored secondary systems. It also expanded the news output, giving gamers an updated look on what was happening around the industry. Without reviews, EGM2 lacked personality and was always overshadowed by its superior original. It featured page after page of bland previews and fighting game strategies, and thanks to Sendai Publishing, EGM2 had a lot of these pages to fill. While the magazine would eventually dwindle to only a few dozen pages a month, it started strong with 200 and 300 pages per issue. Of course, this was mostly filled with obnoxious advertising for games nobody planned on buying. After 4 years of living in Electronic Gaming Monthly's shadow, EGM2 officially became Expert Gamer. Much like EGM2, Expert Gamer ran no reviews, instead focusing on strategy guides and cheat codes. After 39 issues, Expert Gamer became Game Now. Or is that Game Now? In either case, it lasted 27 issues. EGM2's legacy ended on January 2004. So, what does any of this have to do with Street Fighter II? Well, there was that whole analogy at the beginning, and Street Fighter V was just announced. How crazy is that? And it only took them 7 years this time. Meet Max. He's a puppy. He's pretty cute. It's almost as if we're using him specifically to make you forget about the terrible bullshit happening around the world. He can just run around being cute, and you'll forget that for a brief moment at the turn of the century, Foul magazine actually took up shelf space. Targeting video game subculture, Foul's goal was to offend somebody. Anybody. The amateurish articles were littered with the type of politically incorrect jokes and insults that you would expect from a magazine named Foul. The problem is that none of the editors were particularly good at following through with their childish ideas. What we're left with are lame stabs at comedy that consist of trying to get laid at E3, dressing game characters up as women, and this horrible story about leaving your husband for a PlayStation 2. And then there's this. Every issue brought us sexy centerfolds, featuring a collection of women that have little to nothing to do with video games. It's as if the magazine abandons games entirely in order to let their pervy friend photograph women desperate for fame. Sorry, honey, but you're not going to get noticed posing for Foul magazine. The same goes for the game store that chose to go with this advertisement. But even if you can look past the weirdly placed misogyny and rude gay jokes, you were still left with a magazine that didn't know how to cover games. Their reviews were often nonsensical and filled with grammatical errors. They also went with a scoring system guaranteed to confuse readers. State of Emergency scored an 858, which means it's 53 points better than Final Fantasy X. But Grand Theft Auto 3, that game is a full 148 points better than Final Fantasy X, obviously. And 42 points more fun than Jet Set Radio Future. Never forget. This was a magazine that desperately wanted to offend. It hoped to right a string of controversies. And they actually came close, thanks to a certain porn star dressed up as Super Mario. It wasn't enough, and the magazine quickly went out of business. But forget about the nastiness, because Max is doing something cute. Look at Max! Oh, you're such a good boy, aren't you? Yeah, oh yes you are. You're such a good boy. This is the #1 Super Mario game. This is the #1 handheld system, the #1 rhythm game, the #1 hero, the #1 controller, the #1 comic book movie, the #1 Bond, the #1 cause of death. You know how I know this? Because these are all opinions and not actual facts. It's the same way Megaplay could reasonably call itself the #1 all-Sega video game magazine. It's like their opinion, man. Launched in 1990, Megaplay proved that the editors of Electronic Gaming Monthly had a lot of time on their hands. This was a small but not insignificant magazine that focused on the Master System, Genesis, Game Gear, Sega CD, and, for a while, 32X. It was the first of a string of system-specific magazines from Sendai Publishing. The bi-monthly magazine usually ran between 50 to 70 pages, featuring the usual mix of previews and cheat codes. Megaplay would close each issue by spoiling a popular Genesis game, because that's what magazines did at that time. And then there were the reviews, which mirrored EGM's popular 4-critic review crew design. Unfortunately, the layout didn't allow for reviews longer than 35 words. In 1993, Megaplay reviews dropped 2 of the critics and slimmed down to a 2-person team. This included Howard Grossman and Martin Alessi, who was already reviewing games at EGM. The magazine also shifted from a 10-point scale to a percentage system, which was more in line with what Europe was doing at the time. Later, the 4-person review crew would return, but the 2-person Mega reviews would also stick around. I'm not sure why. Megaplay ran until 1995, making it one of Sendai Publishing's most popular EGM spin-offs. And for 5 long years, the magazine continued to call itself the #1 all-Sega video game magazine. It sure beats the hell out of my slogan. Hey, buddy. You look sad. What's wrong? Oh, I know what the problem is. You're upset that Nintendo Power is only published 6 times a year. Oh, you can try to spin me a yarn about how your wife has been cheating on you with your boss and now you're out of job and divorced. But we both know that you're really sad that your favorite Nintendo magazine is bi-monthly. It's just not fair. But don't worry, everything is going to be okay. The year is 1990. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are about to hit the big screen, everybody is excited about a Flash TV show, and you're still a quarter century away from finding out how awful Interstellar is. Best of all, Nintendo Power is about to go monthly. Kind of. Instead of simply releasing 12 issues a year, Nintendo Power decided to go a completely different route. They created a spin-off called Nintendo Power Strategy Guide. This bi-monthly magazine was designed to tackle a single game, starting out with Nintendo's own flagship release, Super Mario Bros. 3. Honestly, this is a pretty good choice. Not only was it the biggest game of its time, but Super Mario Bros. 3 offered literally hundreds of secrets the average gamer would overlook, and the beautiful layout really brings each world to life. Nintendo followed this up with Ninja Gaiden 2, the devilishly hard sequel to one of Tecmo's biggest hits. While this game has a reputation for being difficult, it's not the kind of challenge that requires a strategy guide. The stages are linear, and there aren't any hidden areas to uncover. Truthfully, this should have been part of a regular Nintendo Power issue. The following issue gave us a Final Fantasy II guide, which is easily the most useful of the 4 issues. It offered dungeon maps and the locations for all of the rarest items. For a brief moment, it looked like the Nintendo Power Strategy Guide was going to be a valuable addition to the yearly subscription. And then they released this aimless 4-player extra issue, and that was the end of that. In January of 1991, Nintendo Power switched to a monthly format, effectively canceling the Nintendo Power Strategy Guide. It lasted only 4 issues, 2 of which were actually worth owning. So buck up, pathetic crying man. It's only a matter of time before you get your wish. And look on the bright side. At least you don't have a wife and a job. Welcome to London, the home of James Bond and the Spice Girls. Look, I'm just gonna level with you here. I didn't spend a whole lot of time researching London last night because there was a Friends marathon. Emily's from London, and she was gonna marry Ross. So, let's just go ahead and start this thing over again, okay? Welcome to London, the home of Emily from Friends, and Sega Force magazine. Wait. That's not the right Sega Force magazine. That's a free supplement that came with certain issues of Electronic Gaming Monthly. It was little more than an excuse to recycle previews from older issues, with a few news pieces copied and pasted for good measure. If anything, it was a simple buyer's guide for Sega fans, not to be confused with Megaplay, or Super NES buyer's guide for that matter. The Sega Force I'm talking about came from jolly old England and ran between 1992 and 1993. Instead of limiting their reviews to 35 words, Sega Force published lengthy write-ups that went further in depth. Their issues were also quite a bit larger than system-specific magazines here in the United States, and it ran monthly. On the other hand, I'm not sure how I feel about this depiction of Americans. Despite its good looks, solid writing, and genuinely interesting features, Sega Force only managed to last 19 issues. In those 19 issues, the editors were able to review a total of 295 games, That's 184 Mega Drive games, 50 Game Gear, 47 Master System, and 14 on the Mega CD. Their top-scoring game was Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which earned a 97%. Believe it or not, Tasmania comes in second, with 96%. At 25%, the Great Waldo Search was the worst reviewed game in the magazine's history. In 1993, Impact Magazine chose to spin Sega Force into two separate magazines: Sega Master Force, which covered the Master System, and Sega Force Mega, which looked at the Mega Drive and Mega CD. For whatever reason, the Sega Game Gear remained in both magazines. Of course, none of this should be confused with Turbo Force, or This American Sega Force. Got it? Christ, this really is the worst episode I've done yet. What a cluster. Maybe I can redeem myself when we get to N-Force. Or was that SNES Force? Oh no, not this again. Michael knew that if he refused to give up and practiced every day, he would eventually become the next Tony Hawk. So every day after school, Michael grabbed his board and practiced his moves until he could barely stand. And when he couldn't go outside, he practiced here on his bed. He was dedicated, and he knew that it would eventually pay off. But Michael was wrong. Despite all of the hard work put into skateboarding, Michael simply wasn't good enough. So these days, he picks up missing golf balls for $0.25 each. What a sellout. Much like Michael, Turbo Play believed that if you paid your dues, you would eventually wind up on top. Unfortunately, that's not how the world works. Sometimes you have no control over your ultimate fate. Launched in 1990, Turbo Play is the oldest of the 4 North American magazines created to cater specifically to the TurboGrafx-owning audience. That's right, there were 4 publications dedicated exclusively to the system everybody thinks was a massive flop. It lasted until 1992 and covered nearly all of the console's tumultuous life. While Turbo Force came from the editors of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Turbo Play was a spin-off of the lesser-known Video Games and Computer Entertainment. As such, it retained a lot of what made the original magazine so good, including memorable artwork and exhaustive strategy guides. The writing was also top-notch, often delving into the turbo-related topics few other magazines bothered with. Unlike Turbo Force, which launched a year later, Turbo Play featured reviews. Early on, the reviews were short and lacked a proper score. They eventually switched to a larger format, which mirrored what Video Games and Computer Entertainment was doing. But still, no score. 6 months in, the magazine got the message and switched to a 5-star rating, and then, 2 issues later, to a 10-point rating that also factored in sound, music, graphics, and playability. They stuck with this rating until the final issue in August of 1992. To its credit, Turbo Play lasted 14 issues, which is 10 more than Turbo Force. It also had some of the industry's best covers, as you can see from this crawl. And while the issues were short, they were crammed with well-written pieces that remain worth reading 2 decades later. But this wasn't enough, and the low sales of the TurboGrafx ultimately doomed this well-written magazine. So here's my advice to you, Michael. Get off the skateboard, sell it to a friend, and buy yourself a TurboGrafx 16. It really does have a lot of great games you need to play. I'm talking about Eastbook 1 and 2, and Ninja Spirit, Devil's Crush, Kadash, Bomberman 93, Splatterhouse, Battle Load Runner, Loom. William is not a fan of these magazine retrospectives. Just yesterday, he sent me an angry email that said, I quote, "Get off the internet, you smug asshole. You have no right talking about games. All you do is talk about old Sega magazines. And never anything about Nintendo, you suck. Thank you for your constructive criticism, William. You're right, in the last few weeks we've focused more on Sega than Nintendo. So, in honor of you, today we'll be talking about the Super NES Buyer's Guide, which ran for 3 years in the early 1990s. After seeing the success of Megaplay, Sentai Publishing quickly pieced together a companion guide that reviewed the launch titles, previewed upcoming games, and even offered a few cheat codes. They did this by recycling content from the August 1991 issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly. And they didn't just copy a few previews and tips, they reused everything. What started as a cynical cash grab quickly turned into a magazine with a distinct voice, Sure, we continue to get the same kinds of previews, news write-ups, and letter sections, but at least now it was filled with original content. This included a 3-person review crew section featuring Guy, Dude, and Mike, which may or may not have been the characters in Final Fight. Similar to Mega Play, Super NES Buyer's Guide eventually switched from a 10-point scale to a percentage system. This also included super reviews, which were about 50% longer than the usual vanilla write-ups. And at the end of each issue, the editor would spoil one of the many popular Super Nintendo games. As the title suggests, the Super NES Buyer's Guide had little interest in Nintendo's other consoles. They didn't bother with Nintendo Entertainment System reviews in the early days and avoided the Game Boy. In 1994, they began reporting on the existence of 2 new Nintendo consoles, the Virtual Boy and the Project Reality, which would later become the Ultra 64, and then later become the Nintendo 64. Sadly, Sendai Publishing quietly closed the magazine before either of these systems hit the market. So there you have it, the history of the Super NES Buyer's Guide. I hope you're happy, William. What's this? Hey, he sent me a new message. Wait, what the hell is an SJW? Ah, the United States. It's the place where everything is number one. Well, except for healthcare and life expectancy and education, annual GDP, and, well, pretty much every other important measurement we can think of. Unfortunately, we're also not number one when it comes to game magazines. Not only did Europe have a greater variety in the 1980s and 90s, but some of these magazines still exist. That's certainly more than I can say about Nintendo Power, GamePro, or Hardcore Gamer magazine. In Europe, video game magazines would often cover the whole spectrum, from home console games to the newest computer software. Edge, computers and video games, and the Games Machine would routinely cover the Mega Drive and Super NES, along with the Amiga and Sinclair. Here in the States, we had console mags, and we had computer mags. Next Generation integrated the 2 formats in 1995, but they were among the few to take that leap. I'm not sure if they were first, but it was CVG who largely popularized the format. Launched in 1991, this is one of the longest-running video game magazines of all time, and certainly the one to beat in the 1980s and 90s. But this episode isn't about CVG. Inspired by what computers and video games was doing at the time, Newsfield publication created its own magazine, The Games Machine. This multi-format magazine largely took the style of CVG, and even adopted the same rating system. It ran for 34 issues when Newsfield decided to call it quits. But this episode isn't about the Games Machine. After Newsfield shuttered the magazine, the Games Machine turned into something completely different, yet totally the same. This magazine was Raze, which ran for 12 issues between 1990 and 1991. The magazine was designed with 4 goals in mind. They wanted to be the first to provide exclusive scoops, to become the authoritative voice with their reviews, to create a stylish design for the sophisticated reader, and, most importantly, offer 3 pulsating pull-out posters every month. Trust me, those were their words, not mine. And then there's this unfortunate Japanese stereotype. Unfortunately, I spent so much time talking about CVG and the Games Machine that I won't have any time to talk about the magazine's finer details. So to wrap this episode up, let's just go ahead and jump to the exciting conclusion. Initially, the idea was to run the magazine for a year and then spin it off into 2 console-specific magazines, Sega Force and Nintendo Force. But those plans were put on hold when Newsfield entered liquidation in 1991. Wait, Sega Force? Oh no, here we go again. This is stir fry. I used to hate Asian cuisine as a kid, but now I eat it at least 3 times a week. This could have been said about John Cassavetes, a filmmaker I found painfully droll as a teenager. But 20 years later, I would list Faces and A Woman Under the Influence as 2 of my favorite films. In fact, I've changed my mind about a whole lot of things over the last few decades. I now enjoy ABBA, have a soft spot for full-motion video games, and no longer look both ways before crossing the street. Speaking of which, I used to hate video games and computer entertainment. While GamePro targeted younger kids and Electronic Gaming Monthly was for teens, video games and computer entertainment was aimed directly at adult gamers. No. not that kind of adult gamer. I'm talking about the regular gamer who is in their 20s, 30s, and beyond. And since I wasn't an adult in 1988, this magazine came across as incredibly dull. But I was wrong. Video games and computer entertainment offered some of the best written articles month after month. Instead of limiting the critics to only a few dozen words, reviews would regularly span multiple pages with almost no pictures. The same attention to detail was also brought to their in-depth news section. As the title suggests, video games and computer entertainment covered both video games and, well, computer entertainment. This gave the critics a unique perspective, as they would routinely compare console games to the newest PC releases. And since most of the big innovations would come from computer gaming, the editors of video games and computer entertainment always seemed like they were ahead of the curve. But who am I kidding? The real reason I love this magazine is because of the art. Instead of recycling artwork provided by other companies, video games and computer entertainment had a stable of freelance artists that provided unique takes on popular 8 and 16-bit games. In 1993, the magazine dropped the PC coverage and focused entirely on video games, turning the once great magazine into another generic publication aimed at teens. There was also a spin-off called Tips and Tricks, but we've already covered that. So the moral of the story is that video games and computer entertainment is great, and I should never be afraid to change my mind. Who knows, maybe 20 years from now I'll love all the things I hate. Like The Big Bang Theory, or Nicki Minaj, or that new Christopher Nolan movie. Previously on Lost. Ben tries to convince everybody to go back to the island. Sawyer reads a book. Locke presses buttons, and Megaplay, Turbo Force, and Super NES Buyer's Guide are all spun off from Electronic Gaming Monthly. In a twist tailor-made for a science fiction television show about a time-traveling island, it turns out that Game Players is a spin-off. Also, Richard Alpert doesn't age. But we're going to gloss over that fact because Game Players actually started its life as Game Players' Nintendo Buyer's Guide back in 1988. Sold as an unofficial alternative to Nintendo Power, this magazine lasted 3 years and ended up changing its name to Game Player's Strategy Guide to Nintendo Games. 1 year after launching the Nintendo Guide, publisher Signal Research created a spin-off called Game Players. This bi-monthly magazine would cover more than just the Nintendo Entertainment System, which meant previewing games for various Sega, Atari, and NEC consoles. The format proved popular, and in October 1989, the magazine went monthly. Visually, Game Players magazine looked about as sterile as a hospital. The page layout was boring and predictable, filled with previews and reviews that sounded more like press releases. Rarely were the write-ups critical, and the magazine didn't issue proper scores until well into its life. And compared to a magazine like GamePro, Game Players looked bland and lifeless. By 1993, it was clear that the look wasn't going to cut it. The magazine ditched the clinical layout and brought in a whole bunch of pop culture nonsense. They opted for bright neon colors, referencing Beverly Hills 90210, and even scored games with an exclamation point. This extreme makeover allowed the editors to show more of a personality, making it a funnier magazine with better reviews. But with so much competition on the newsstands, Game Players had a hard time staying relevant. In hopes of adding more excitement to the long-running magazine, the publishers changed the name to Ultra Game Players. This was intended to coincide with the Ultra 64, but that connection fizzled out the moment the system changed its name to the Nintendo 64. The relaunched magazine featured an updated design and more serious tone. It only lasted 23 issues. Beyond Game Players and Ultra Game Players, Signal Research published a number of other spin-offs. You may remember Game Player's Encyclopedia, Game Player's Sega Genesis Strategy Guide, and of course, Game Player's Strategy Guide to Game Boy games, which all debuted in 1990. Lost didn't have any spin-offs. There was no After Lost, or Lost Viver, or Lost the College Years, so maybe the analogy doesn't work. But at least it gives me a chance to see Ben getting punched in the face again. Let me introduce you to Brian. This go-getter has his own small shop right here on the beach. Unfortunately, Brian's store doesn't get many customers, and he thinks he knows why. He's upset there's too much competition, and we think he might be onto something. So instead of working on the beach, Brian started selling this gimmicky marijuana leaf t-shirt at dispensaries up and down the West Coast. Brian is living the American dream. This story sounds suspiciously similar to that of Consumer Guide, Strategies for Nintendo Games. Seeing how crowded the newsstand was at the time, the publisher behind Consumer Guide made the conscious decision to avoid the head-to-head face-off with GamePro and Electronic Gaming Monthly, and instead hit school book fairs. Despite looking exactly like a traditional magazine, Consumer Guide, Strategies for Nintendo Games, was passed off as a book. As such, the 1989 guide found its way next to The Manly Art of Knitting, and Anybody Can Be Cool, but Awesome Takes Practice. With Consumer Guide being the only book that's even remotely video game related, it's easy to see why this magazine in disguise found its way into so many kids' homes. Similar to Game Players, the layout was dull and the writing was intended to hype the game, no matter how bad it was. Beyond describing the story, Strategies for Nintendo Games offered, strategies for Nintendo games. Some of these tips came in the form of passwords and cheat codes, while others were suggestions on how to improve play. The write-ups were bad, and the tips weren't very useful. But what were you gonna do? Buy a book called Mommy Drinks Because You're Bad? Jesus, is that a real book? That sounds like wildly inappropriate subject matter for a school book fair. Seeing the popularity of the first guide, Consumer Guide released a string of follow-ups, including Hot Tips for the Coolest Nintendo Games, More Strategies for Nintendo Games, Nintendo Fun, the book for beginners, The Winner's Guide to Nintendo, Winning at Nintendo, and Winning Tips for Nintendo, all of which seem specifically geared for search engine optimization. I'm not sure what happened to Consumer Guide. I assume they went out of business the moment kids stopped reading. I suppose I could have done more research and came up with a satisfying conclusion to this episode, but that doesn't really sound like something I would do. So instead I'm going to end with Brian letting us know what he thinks of his newfound fortune. Welcome to E3. It's a big video game trade show where a lot of announcements are made. Maybe you've heard of it. This is Show Daily. It's the official E3 magazine, and full of news about those big announcements. A new issue is published for each day the show floor is open. It has a bland look and... Hey! Wake up! Look, I get it. There's nothing worse than talking about a trade magazine that will be obsolete in 24 hours. Most of the magazines we've covered have had at least reviews and rumors and editorial features. I mean, Foul may have been an awful magazine, but this dopey article about leaving your husband for a PlayStation 2 can still be enjoyed a decade later. Show Daily, on the other hand, is more of a newspaper, so its pages are filled with boring announcements that you may have missed. But you can wake up now, because this episode isn't actually about Show Daily. You see, there was a time when one of the perks of going to E3 was collecting weird and obscure magazines. Between the publishers buying their own booths, and special areas set up specifically to hand out periodicals from around the world, magazines flowed like water at E3. Hell, at $5 a bottle, there's a good chance magazines were even more abundant than water. Of course, this kind of thing wasn't exclusive to E3. I remember picking up issues of NewType Gaming and Turbo Force at the Consumer Electronics Show back in the early 1990s. Where else would I find a magazine like 3 for 3DO enthusiasts? It's not like my local Safeway was going to stock a magazine about 3DO. So for a fan of games journalism, I use trade shows as a way to find and collect magazines. Sometimes this is a good thing. Next Generation made a splash by debuting a limited edition cover that could only be found at E3. But there was also a dark side to collecting magazines at conventions. For one thing, there were a bunch of questionable publications that had no right being at a video game trade show. I'm talking about CI6 Auto Style and BPM. All this did was weigh down my already heavy bag. With print media on the decline, you don't see as many magazines being passed out at trade shows. Although expected, it's still a disappointing development. Weirdly enough, that's not the only thing ruining the once great tradition. With airline companies charging absurd fees for heavy luggage, the days of carrying home dozens of magazines are behind us. In some ways, it's easier like this, but part of me yearns for the days when I could uncover a hidden gem like 3 for 3DO enthusiasts. This is me on GamePro TV back in 1990. I was 12. I gave really horrible advice for Ghouls and Ghosts on the Sega Genesis, then had two bozos compliment my totally bodacious tip. Hey Brendan Howard, why don't you tell me what I won?
And to show you our appreciation, we're going to be sending you your very own GamePro tee. Yeah. Hey, that's right. And that's all the time they're letting us have this week. And besides, our game techs are fried. That's right, bud.
That's right, bud. Fried. With the syndicated TV show already under my belt, I felt like I was on track to become the next big games journalist. You know, like Scary Larry and Bruised Lee. 2 years later, I found myself sneaking into the Consumer Electronics Show as a teenager. I managed to get in 3 years in a row, and truly felt like I would eventually become one of my idols. So it probably won't surprise anybody to learn that I attempted to create my own zine back in the early 1990s. This fuzzy picture is all that remains of my very first attempt, Right Steps. And this was my second attempt, Coin Op. Before long, I settled on the name Insert Coin and started publishing them bi-monthly. Of course, the magazine mostly covered console games, so neither name made any sense, but I'm pretty sure we've already established that I'm an idiot. Despite becoming a Z-list celebrity thanks to GamePro TV, my zine was modeled off of what Electronic Gaming Monthly was doing at the time. And when I say modeled, I mean that I completely ripped off what EGM was doing. Let me give you a few examples. On the left is EGM's rumor section, which was written by Quarterman. On the right is my rumor section, written by Token Man. Christ, that's embarrassing. Here we see EGM's Game of the Month, and on the right is my version. The similarities don't end there, as you'll see by the review layout. I had 4 people reviewing games, and even had my own Sushi X. We called him Dr. X. The zine also included pointless top 10 lists and archives of past reviews, just like Electronic Gaming Monthly. The only real difference was the scoring, which used letter grades instead of numbers. It's a format we still use at Defunct Games. Looking over the zine 2 decades later, I'm struck by how much writing there was. Sure, some of the layouts were blatant rip-offs, but there are also great features about the 16-bit system war, and even smaller systems like the 3DO and Jaguar. I enjoyed this Yay or Nay section, which was inspired by a similar feature found in video games and computer entertainment. And I managed to get my friends together to write more than the usual capsule reviews. I'm horrified at how poorly written these articles are. Even at the low price of free, I feel like people paid too much. But at least it got me to practice writing, and the Defunct Games you see today is a result of the many years of sticking to the craft. That sounded a lot more uplifting in my head. I guess what I'm trying to say is, go to law school and don't waste your time writing about video games. This is Jeremy, a mild-mannered shoe salesman who one day realized that his life was, well, kind of bland. He needed an identity, something that would set him apart from all of the other losers at the mall. So now he dresses up like Sonic the Hedgehog and spreads the word of Sega. I might have gone with Knuckles, but that's just me. Jeremy embodies the spirit of Super Play, the single best Nintendo-focused magazine of all time. Sure, he may be dressing up as the competition, but he has the same drive that made this UK magazine worth buying. Super Play was so good that I actively sought out the magazine at a local import shop, and I didn't even care about the price gouging. If American gamers knew just how good their UK counterparts had it, they would have never settled for the Super NES Buyer's Guide. Launched soon after Nintendo's 16-bitter, Super Play found itself in a weird position. You see, the monthly publication had been passed over as the official licensed Nintendo magazine, which meant Super Play, like Jeremy, had to find its own niche. They opted for international coverage, with an emphasis on the type of role-playing games that normally didn't make it to Europe. Unable to use the Nintendo name, the editors chose Super Play, a not-so-subtle nod to the Super NES. The logo sports a strange circle between the U and P and the translation of the name in kanji, both designed to sell the magazine's international vibe. The pages were filled with reviews of games the editors had imported from Japan and the United States, which often resulted in Super Play being the first to review most big releases. The reviews were often long and presented in a colorful layout, Much like every other UK magazine of the time, Superplay used a percentage system. They reviewed just over 600 games across 47 issues, with an average score of 69%. The top reviewed games included Street Fighter II Turbo, Super Mario All-Stars, and Super Street Fighter II, all which received 96%. The magazine's lowest scoring games were Pit Fighter at 14%, Time Cop at 15%, and American Gladiators at 16%. But the real reason to love Superplay was for the covers. Instead of using company art like so many other magazines, Superplay hired Will Overton to create some of the best covers of all time. Month after month, Will turned some of the biggest video games into manga-influenced works of art. They're incredible. Even as the popularity of the Super NES began to wane, Superplay was able to turn out a high-quality product 12 times a year. The magazine said goodbye in September 1996, only to reappear as N64 Magazine 1 year later. After that, it was succeeded by NGC Magazine, which later relaunched as N-Gamer. While most of the magazines I've talked about this month have been long forgotten, Superplay still has a sizable fan base online. With the gorgeous artwork and a specialized focus on niche adventure games, it's easy to see why this remains so highly respected. If American magazines had been even a fraction as interesting as Superplay, the series of videos would have been a lot less painful to endure. Everybody loves a good underdog story. We can't help but cheer for Rudy, hope the feds will quit chasing Dr. Kimball, and pray that the kid with only 3 weeks of karate training can defeat the city's most despicable supervillain. We see ourselves in these characters, and hope that one day we'll be able to rise up against all odds and win the day. When it comes to classic video game magazines, Die Hard Game Fan is the ultimate underdog story. It's the tale of a few passionate gamers who created their own fanzine, found investors, and, surprising everybody, went head-to-head against the biggest magazines of the era. Unfortunately, it's also a story that involves shady business practices, illegal drugs, missed deadlines, and even a Las Vegas hooker. Before there was a magazine, there was Die Hard Video Games, a California-based retailer specializing in import Japanese games. This led Tim Lindquist and Dave Halverson, a couple of self-professed heavy metal fans, to create Die Hard Game Fan on an old Macintosh 2X computer. Much like Superplay in the UK, Game Fan's goal was to shine a light on the Japanese games getting no coverage in the media. What the magazine lacked in professionalism and polish, it more than made up for with enthusiasm and passion. In the early days, members of the staff would drive around California targeting newsstands. They would give out free issues to anybody willing to put the magazine on the rack, all in hopes of building up a fan base. By the second issue, Die Hard Game Fan had secured a distribution deal with Lowrider, which helped get the magazine into liquor stores throughout the country. Die Hard Game Fan had worked out a lot of its kinks by the time I found it on the newsstand, but it was painfully clear that it wasn't like any of the other magazines. The articles were filled with spelling errors, and the layout was a mess. The editors were so excited about video games that they ended up giving nearly everything they reviewed a 90% or higher. Unfortunately, not everybody on the staff knew how to write. The magazine was littered with sentences that made absolutely no sense. Here's an example.
And now, with another episode of Simple Thoughts with Die Hard Game Fan. After viewing this fine theatrical release a few months ago and not being that impressed, except for a chance to glare at my ex-girlfriend Kim, yeah, that's it, me and Kim, we, met on a cruise. Yeah, she couldn't stay away from me. That's it, yeah. I wondered how Ocean would make this into a game.
While I joke about the grammatical errors and the amateurish design, they are just two of the elements I find to be incredibly endearing about Die Hard Game Fan. It often felt like the editors were so passionate about video games that they simply had to spread the word, even if that meant learning how to create, publish, and distribute a magazine as they went along. Behind the scenes, this learning process was anything but smooth. The editors routinely butted heads, and the magazine was fraught with drama. Many of the allegations seem to center around Dave Halverson, who has been accused of dropping acid before reviewing games, paying hookers at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show, and even buying a 3-foot Sonic the Hedgehog statue instead of paying the staff. All this excess resulted in missed deadlines and a deeply divided workspace. The sad truth is that I could spend the next 2 hours talking about nothing but crazy diehard game fan allegations. There are stories about mafia connections, investors being swindled out of money, and even fistfights in the office. There's enough backstabbing and trash talking for a 6-season TV series written by a very coked-up Aaron Sorkin. Years after the smoke cleared, Tim Lindquist, Terry Wolfinger, and Greg Off started a new magazine in the spirit of Die Hard Game Fan. This was Hardcore Gamer Magazine, which ran between 2005 and 2010. You can find 36 issues of the magazine in PDF form at defunctgames.com. You should go and download them and forget all about the nasty allegations associated with Die Hard Game Fan. Jerry's a little pissed off at the mall. Not all malls, just this one in particular. He's been yelling at the door for nearly 2 minutes now, and everybody thinks he's nuts. But not me. I see that look in his eyes, and I can tell that he's desperate. You see, it's Christmas Eve, and the malls are supposed to be open until 4 p.m. The hours are clearly marked on the door, yet it's 3:50 and the doors are locked. The guy needs a gift, and the stupid locked door is keeping him from making his kid's day merry. It's just not fair. Like Jerry, I'm feeling the holiday crunch. Tomorrow's the final episode, so I'm just gonna have to accept that I'll never be able to get around to talking about every magazine. As far as I can tell, I have 2 options. I can either freak out like Jerry, or try and quickly go through every magazine before tomorrow's finale. While every instinct is telling me to freak out, I guess I'll go with Plan B. Let's start with Electronic Gaming Monthly and GamePro, 2 magazines I didn't cover because it's hard to summarize 20 years of history into 3 minutes. Maybe one day I'll dig deeper into these magazines. I also didn't talk about Game Informer. You might think that's because they're still around, but you're wrong. It's because they hate me. I miss dozens of magazines only found in the UK. I'm talking about S, the Sega magazine, Your Sinclair, Mean Machine Sega, Amiga Power, Nintendo Magazine System, and even Page 6, though I really regret not talking about Zap 64. Then there are all the magazines from the last 15 years, like At Gamer, Xbox Nation, PSM, Play, PS Extreme, Official US PlayStation Magazine, and Games for Windows Magazine. And just for good measure, maybe I should just add a crawl showing the rest of the magazines I won't get around to covering. Actually, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Now, while all these images scroll by, let me take the time to thank you for watching these videos. I've had a lot of fun telling stories about these old magazines, and part of me wants to keep doing it. Perhaps if there's a demand, I'll drill down deeper into these magazines and tell even more stories about 20th century game journalism. There's a lot of material to mine. I don't see any other people talking about it. But it could be that nobody is talking about it because people aren't interested in these old magazines. Sure, they'll play the old games, but who cares what Electronic Gaming Monthly said about Final Fight when there are thousands of blogs online? I don't know. Maybe there's an audience for this kind of thing. Christ, is this thing still going? Huh. Well, anyway, I finally picked up a Wii U, so, now I have all of the next generation consoles. Can we even still call this the next generation? I don't know. Regardless. I've been working my way through Super Mario World. It's fun. I'll probably talk more about it, and oh, wait, well, I guess this is the end of the crawl. Shouldn't there be some sort of wrap-up here? Maybe we can get back to Jerry or something? No? Alright, just roll the outro. Oh my god! It's George! John! Oh, lady, can you get your hat out of the way? I'm trying to make a video here. Anyway, as you can see, it's the Beatles. What you're looking at is footage of the band conquering America. It was kind of a big deal. Ask your parents. In a time before the internet, the Beatles led the British invasion, which brought with it a number of similar acts. These 4 boys changed music forever. 3 decades later, Next Generation magazine spawned a brand new kind of British invasion. Okay, maybe that's a bit dramatic, but in my opinion, this is not only the greatest video game magazine of all time, but also an important turning point for game journalism. Next Generation is the Beatles of video game magazines. Launched in 1995 to coincide with the new era of 32-bit game systems, it was immediately clear that Next Generation was a little different. For one thing, it focused more on the industry than the individual games. Sure, it had the usual reviews and preview section, but most of the pages were filled with developer interviews and lengthy articles that addressed all sides of the games business. This monthly publication was also more confrontational than other magazines. This is largely because Next Generation was the American spin-off of Edge, a popular UK magazine with a reputation for harsh reviews. The editors of Next Generation brought that aggressive British sensibility to the States, leading to some of the best interviews you'll ever read. It's important to remember that at this time, very few magazines published interviews with the heads of Sega, Nintendo, and the various other third parties. And if they did snag a conversation with Howard Lincoln or Tom Kalinske, the questions were usually softballs. Magazines like GamePro and Electronic Gaming Monthly didn't think their readers would be interested in hardball interviews, so they focused more on the colorful previews that fed the hype machine. Next Generation was different. Each issue featured several interviews, both big and small. They spent a lot of time talking to the lesser-known game makers, getting the developers' take on the industry. They would also interview the bigger players, including the heads of every important publisher you can think of. They somehow were able to get Atari head Sam Tramiel to threaten to sue Sony, and Sega's Tom Kalinske said, with a straight face, that the 32X will outsell the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and even the Saturn. Although influential, Next Generation was never as popular as Electronic Gaming Monthly and GamePro. In 1999, the publisher shook things up with a brand new design. The name was simplified to Next Gen, and it started to veer from its original goal. More of the magazine ended up being devoted to individual games, with reductions in news and industry write-ups. Worst of all, the magazine dabbled in cheat codes, something it vowed to never print in years past. This was the beginning of the end. Through redesigns and a change to a larger format, Next Generation lost a lot of the original charm. But it didn't matter, because the magazine had already changed the game. You started to see more developer interviews pop up in popular magazines, and industry news started to get covered. And with the invent of the internet, blogs and websites have carried on the tradition of critiquing every move Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft make. To many people, video games are about more than the individual titles and hype. They're about the people that create them, and the business that makes it all possible. And like the Beatles, Next Generation will live forever inside every one of us.